Uh, what I chose to do was a presentation on stamped envelopes. It's an area that has not received a lot of attention with Philippine collectors, at least in the journals and the writing. And it's kind of a fertile area where there's a lot to learn, a lot to play with. And I thought, well, this would be kind of fun to do an overview for the meeting today. And when I say an overview, I mean, this is a big area. There's no way that I could cover everything. So today I want to go through with some selected points and kind of touch upon, I guess I'll call them each of the eras in which these envelopes were used, and then cover it from beginning to end. So what do we mean by stamped envelopes? Not everyone knows what that is. So I started here with a picture of one. Basically, it's another form of postage. If you go to the post office, they'll sell you a stamp, which you can stick on your own envelope or your package or whatever it is. But in many cases, the post office would also sell you an envelope that had printing on it, which incorporated postage in that. As we go through, there are some areas where you can have some discussion and debate as to what a stamped envelope is or not, and we'll talk about a couple of those. But basically, we start with the concept of the envelope itself coming from the post office. Now, why that wording? Why call them a stamped envelope? Because it's a little confusing. It's not just any envelope with a stamp on it. That wording came from the postal authorities. Next slide, please. And I've shown some examples here taken from archival information to show how the post office was using these words. Now, these particular ones came from the U.S. Postal Service, from which the Philippine Bureau of Post drew substantially. And you can see in the first illustration here, we've got prices of stamped envelopes and newspaper wrappers. That was a publication provided to the public. That's how the post office referred to this product. You see in the lower left corner a bit of the letterhead of the Stamped Envelope Agency, which was basically a U.S. Post Office employee who was on site at the manufacturing facility where they made the envelopes. All of these envelopes were manufactured by private entities. None were made by government printing offices themselves. And in the lower right, I've got another example just showing how in ordinary conversation or communications, they referred to this product as a stamped envelope. Now, not everyone referred to it that way. I believe in the British Commonwealth world, the terminology was pre-stamped envelope. You sometimes see initials PSE used, particularly in stamp catalogs when someone's using an abbreviation. And it's all a part of the broader world of postal stationery, which includes postal cards, for example. And you see it referred to different ways. Gonzaken is the word you'll see used often when you're in Germany. And there are many other terms. So was this a new invention? When did stamped envelopes first come about? Whoops, we went too far and we don't have, okay. The world's first postage stamp, you ask any collector, they'll probably tell you it was the penny blank from May of 1840. But how many collectors knew that the world's first stamped envelope was issued at the very same time? They called it the Mulready envelope because the guy who designed it, famous artist of the time, was named Mulready. And they came out with this, and the stamp was a success. The Mulready envelope was a flop. No one liked the way it looked. So after a short time, they redesigned stamped envelopes to have a more traditional design the way it looks today. So what we tend to see is an envelope with something that looks like a stamp on it. But is that what we always call it? If it's not a stamp, it's an indicium. And the reasoning why people don't necessarily want to call it a stamp in the collector's world is that if you cut it out and paste it on an envelope, it's not good for postage. Now, I picked this particular slide to show because I thought it was an interesting example from a lot of perspectives. it shows something that we see when you're in the buying world, that this particular envelope has three things going for it. It is a stamped envelope, which you can see with the indicium. It's a U.S. envelope with the additional words Philippines underneath it, which denominates it for use by the Bureau of Posts. It's got a stamp on it, which added additional postage because the envelope was at 2 cents, good for domestic postage, but they needed 5 for international. And of course, it goes to a rather interesting place. You don't see too much mail going to Nairobi from Cebu. And in addition to that, it has a pack boat marking on it, indicating that it might not have originated in Cebu, but hit the postal system there because it was sent from one of the other provincial areas on a boat. When you are valuing these, you have a value for the envelope, you have a value for the stamp, and you have a value for the postal history. In this case, the postal history aspect trumps all the others. The three are not additive. So in this case, actually, the postal stationery would be the easiest to buy in terms of your expenditure. And so that's something to keep in mind. And a lot of people will see a stamped envelope that gets a price at an auction and think it's for the envelope, but it's really not. You have to consider those postal history aspects whenever you're looking at the used ones. So when did stamped envelopes first arrive in the Philippine postal system? Well, you won't find them used in the Spanish period because the Spaniards didn't use them. You won't find them used from the independence aguinaldo type usages because they didn't get around to that. They had adhesives, but they didn't have stamped envelopes. They came with the Americans. And I picked this one, kind of illustrate a couple of things, because it's not a stamped envelope. It's a regular envelope where someone took a cutout and pasted it on, trying to use it for postage, unsuccessfully. But I really love this ugly cover because of when it was used. It shows that the Americans already had postal stationery. They had stamped envelopes and used them at that time. It's just in this particular case, this was a soldier from the Oregon Volunteers. They had arrived in Manila Bay on a transport on June 30th. And on the 23rd of July, a transport was going back to the United States. This was the Transport Australia. And they put mail on it. But at that time, that was 6 days before the postal agents got their supplies. So they didn't have any way to postmark things, to process it, to put it in mail bags. So this got processed at San Francisco, where San Francisco recognized that the cutout was no good and marked it with their postage due mark for 2 cents due as it went on to the addressee in Illinois. How do you identify these things? You really have to be a detective, and you have to look at the overall, saying, you know, where it's going. In this case, it's easy because you've got a regimental marking on it showing that it was approved from the 2nd Oregon. That's a good giveaway. Otherwise, you just have to look at the markings and the San Francisco receipt stamp on the back and relate that. There were 3 of these transport period shipments that went before the Philippine postmarks started. So what happened after the postal agents got their supplies? Well, we know they got stamps, but did they get stamped envelopes? They sure did. And what we see on the left hand of the slide is a clip from a document that exists in National Archives at Washington, which is a recap showing the postage that was shipped with the postal agents when they were departing San Francisco for Manila. You see at the first, we have a listing of stamps starting with 1 cent denomination and so forth. And a little farther down where you see the arrow, you see 20,000, number 5, first Q, standing for first quality, 2 cent ENV for envelopes. 5,000, number 9, and 5,000 number 13. Well, what do these code numbers mean? Well, on the right-hand side, I've given you a clip from a document that's available on the stampsmarter.com website, among many of these, where they have collected a lot of original post office documents. This one happens to be on a price list from 1899. And the interesting thing here from a philatelic standpoint is the column on the left entitled size. And it lists 14 different numbers here. And I don't like to call this a size chart because it's really more of a product thing. And it really doesn't relate to envelope sizes for anyone else but the U.S. Post Office. Commercial envelope makers had their own sizes. Other postal departments had their sizes. But this is the way the post office referred to their envelopes. And if you went in to order them, you would ask for a number 5 or a number 9 or a number 13. And you can see they've got the dimensions listed there. Of course, they're in inches. A lot of the catalogs now list them in metric and millimeter, but of course at that time the measurements that they made at the factory were in the English inches system. The next column you see is for denomination, and then quality is either first, second, or I believe if you look under number 6, you see the word Manila. And Manila doesn't have any geographic connection to the Philippines, except that Manila paper was originally made from old rope. And rope was made with hemp, and hemp was supplied primarily from Manila, which was the world capital. So the paper manufacturers wanted to refer to that product. They didn't want to call it hemp paper, so they called it Manila paper, and it denoted a very strong paper, which unfortunately hasn't stood the test of aging. It becomes pretty brittle, but those qualities were available. And the interesting thing is that we don't have every denomination and every paper offered with every size. So instead of having 14 envelopes in 4 denominations and 5 types of paper for 280 envelopes, we have considerably fewer. And in the Philippines, a lot fewer than what was available in the US. This is an example here of a number 5 envelope. It was the most common size. This is on first quality paper, and this is, I believe, one from the post office supplies that was sold in Manila, which they got 20,000 in their first shipment. First quality paper was a very good paper, often in white paper, and they also offered it in a form with a yellow tint they called amber. This one you can find, and the neat thing about the military station period is most people have focused on the postmarks, and they become very popular, but you can also focus on the postal issues and see how many of those you can find. And here we have one of the envelopes. Next slide. We have a number 9, and a number 9 is a monster. You don't have to use a ruler because these will not fit in most of the plastic sleeves that you see available for collector supplies. And only 5,000 of those were provided to the Manila station. And finding that's kind of tough. And that's why I'm very happy to have this one, even though it's a little rough. It certainly carried a lot of volume. This particular one was set up for 10 cents worth of postage, which was a multiple weight of probably up to 5 ounces of contents. Now, you can't buy and collect these items in mint condition from the military station period, because at that time, the post office there, the military postal stations, were branches of the U.S. Post Office, and they used U.S. postage. And you can find mint envelopes, but you have no way of knowing that they came from any particular post office. So in this case, they're great things to add to your collection, but you need to have them in a used format. But a lot of the postage stamps and postal stationery from that period did not get bought at the military postal stationery, postal station. Soldiers brought them from home. And here are two examples, and they're easy to tell because these came with corner cards that were pre-printed, one from Colorado there at the top, another from Minnesota. And they're a really kind of interesting, fun thing to collect. The one on the bottom is actually a very old one. It was about 5-6 years obsolete at the time. And also unusual because the soldier brought 5-cent envelopes. At that time, they really didn't know what the postage rate was going to be. The post office did allow the U.S. rates for U.S. citizens at that time. Now, the military station period lasted about a year until May 1st of 1899, when decisions were made and we had gone past that negotiation period with Spain. And the decision was made to establish a postal system, not just for the military stations, which incidentally served the city of Manila and some of the other provincial capitals where the troops were there, but to establish a true system for the islands. This did not draw upon or extend the Spanish system. It was very different. And they, of course, drew upon what they were used to doing, which was the U.S. postal rules and system. They also used postage, which was supplied from the U.S., but they didn't have special designs yet. So they used U.S. envelopes and stamps and printed the word Philippines under them. The initial order was for just stamps. And after a couple of months, they ordered 2 types of postal stationery. They ordered envelopes in the common 2-cent denomination on white paper in number 5, which we see at the left. And that is the most common size and most common envelope from that period. So they also offered something else, number 12. But a number 12 wasn't an envelope. It's a wrapper. And this was a design. Now, these were in use in the system until about the 1930s. And it was designed for mailing newspapers. So often they're called newspaper wrappers. What you did with it was to roll up your newspaper or your magazine or catalog or whatever you were mailing at a discounted rate. Then you would get this wrapper, which was basically a flat piece of paper. But the very top, and this one you can see, it still has an envelope looking shape to it. On the back side of that was gummed, just like an envelope flap. So you'd wrap this around your rolled newspaper, and then you'd moisten the flap and seal it. And it provided a sleeve where you could write an address, and it also had an indicium on it with some postal value, in this case, a penny, which was good for, I believe, up to 4 ounces at the discounted rate for printed matter. And it also allowed the postal agents to see what you were mailing inside because it didn't completely conceal the newspaper or whatever it was, and confirm that you weren't just sending personal stuff, you were sending a printed item. Now, one other thing that is interesting about this period is that we call this overprinted, but it's really not in this case, because the Philippine slug was mounted into the envelope machinery next to the die and printed at the same time as the indicium. That's true for these, the major ones. There were some ones that were done separately, and you get a lot of interesting things that you can collect. Now, next slide. Later on, they added an additional denomination and did it because they reduced the rate within the islands to 1 cent per half ounce. It was 2 cents per full ounce. By reducing the rate, they also reduced the increment and had an argument that they really weren't changing the rate too much, but most letters were less than a half ounce. And so they had a new rate. And there was a need for 1 cent stamps, but also a need for 1 cent envelopes. But before the envelopes got there, this particular person got creative and took a 1 cent wrapper and did a homemade job to turn it into an envelope. And I just love this little item. I think as you go through this, you'll see that I'm kind of a fan of these homemade type things. So now, as of December, they ordered 1 cent envelopes. They got, well, they ordered them in November, but it took a month for the order to get to Washington. It took a few days for it to get from Washington to Hartford, Connecticut, where they manufactured these. And then they were shipped from Connecticut December 16th and arrived in Manila in January. So now you had 3. But one thing, whoops, there we go. One thing that was really unknown for a long time was this small envelope. It was a number 1. And a number 1 envelope got very little use in the United States because it was small. I don't know why it was kept, other than perhaps use for small courtesy, social communications, thank you notes, what have you. Some people called it the ladies' envelope. And why in the world would that dainty little envelope be shipped to Manila, where the major users were businesses and, of course, a bunch of soldiers? And we have the mystery solved courtesy of some things that have been found in archival sources now, where somebody just screwed up. They ordered number 1 instead of number 5. And so 30,000 of these out of about 300,000 of this envelope got shipped in the number 1 size, and are a fun thing to look for. The next item is something that's kind of off the beaten path. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of discussion as to what constitutes a stamped envelope. The post office considered to be something that had postage printed on it, but there are other envelopes that did postal duty that didn't require a stamp. Now, some of you were here a session or 2 back. You heard Les Lanfear do a presentation on these. It was great. Les covers these in his exhibit, and they were used in the possessions areas as well. And I've given 4 examples showing 4 different ways that this type of stationery was used. It has a penalty clause showing that it was legal for use by government agencies without the requirement to add postage. And a lot of people will say, well, that's not postal stationery because it doesn't have postage on it. But it sure is interesting and collectible. And it's a personal favorite of mine. And I'd like to show these because it's something you don't see every day. And in the Philippines, it's unusual because it was only in major use until 1905, because there were some changes made then. Here we have a card in the upper left, a true envelope at the lower left, a label from a package. They could ship packages as well as just letters. In a folded letter, this one was a form that you folded up and you wrote on the inside. And you'll see that one I pointed, the arrow has OB on it. And that's kind of fun because it's a very early, the earliest that I've seen of the use of OB, official business. That became very prevalent later. And it wasn't necessarily that you had to print these. In fact, these penalty envelopes did not come from the post office. Anyone could create them. The individual departments could have them printed, or they got envelopes and used a rubber stamp like here. Or what happened if you didn't have one? Well, you roll your own. There was no requirement that you had to have a particular form of printing. In this case, we see somebody used a typewriter and somebody just wrote it out, and it was workable either way. Later on, after 1905, the Bureau of Posts was establishing that they were not getting enough compensation out of the sale of postage stamps, that the major user was the government. And so they wanted to make arrangements to have other government agencies contribute toward the cost of the postage. And so that went into effect in 1906. So government agencies, other than mainly the Bureau of Posts, had to use postage, but they still used the old envelopes. And in this case, they continued to put a rubber stamp for penalty mail, even though they needed to put stamps on it. And did. This one's kind of neat for registered. 8 cents was the registry fee. 10 cents worth of postage means that this envelope would have weighed more than a half ounce in less than one. And then later on, you see the continuation of penalty mail and these stationary items, mainly used by the Bureau of Posts in the Philippines. But since the Philippine government fit in under the War Department in terms of the Washington hierarchy, their decision from Bureau of Posts couldn't affect other U.S. government agencies. So any other agency of the U.S. government got to continue using penalty stationery without having to put postage on it, such as we see with the Geodetic Survey here on the bottom. So moving on from that, there are a lot of interesting things to collect. I don't have anywhere near the time to talk about them all, so I'm going to zoom on here to the next era, which started in 1906 when the first Philippine-specific issues were put out. They started with stamps in 1906. I've got some die proofs showing the two lowest denominations. And next to them, the postal cards that were printed using the very same dies for the equivalent value postal cards. And on the right, similar concepts of design, but the profiles. And they had to use a profile design for the stamped envelopes because of the embossment. You couldn't see a full face type thing as they show with Rizal and McKinley, because it wouldn't do well for the embossment. We'll see where that posed a problem a little later on. And there's also a delay between the issuance of the stamped envelopes in the new design versus the stamps. It was about 2 years. And it mainly had to do with the fact that the government was changing stamped envelope manufacturing contractors. They went to a new company, and they did not do the Philippine ones in 1906, mainly, I think, because they were on the tail end of the contract with the existing contractor and suspected they were going to go to somebody new.
Which they did.
They absolutely did, as we'll see. This shows the two most common envelopes. The Bureau of Posts was very selective and very conservative in choosing which of the many different sizes and papers to use. They stuck with white paper for general post office sales, and they stuck with 2 basic sizes. But as you can see here, we've learned a lot since the last couple of catalogs as to how many of these things were put out. If you looked at the 1983 catalog, you'd see the numbers that I've listed here that look kind of modest. If you looked at the 2009 update, you'd see an increase. After 2009, I stumbled on to the original order records in the National Archives, which were not in any post office record. They were in the War Department records. And we see that the quantities were quite a bit different. And this accounts for the many, many varieties that you can find. They were issued over a period of 35 years, different watermarks. And the corner cards that you see in the left, what you see here are the ways that the Bureau of Posts preferred to sell these envelopes. They wanted people to put a return address, so they had them printed with this as a prompter for people. They also supplied a much smaller quantity without the corner card for people who wanted to have their own printed or do their own. Now, next slide, please. They also made available for the first 10 years or so what they call special request envelopes. Special request envelopes were very popular in the United States. More than half of all of the stamped envelopes were ordered specially. And if you ordered a box of 500 or in quantities of 500 per box, they would print your corner card on it for free. But this was not promoted by the Bureau of Posts. Some ordered it. The biggest user was General Bandholz. He was the head of the Philippine Constabulary. He was the J. Edgar Hoover of the Philippines, a guy you wanted to be friendly with. And he was also a dyed-in-the-wool stamp collector. So he ordered all kinds of envelopes for use by the Philippine Constabulary in different colors and sizes. And so you have a lot of interesting things you can collect. Now, could you also get them for non-government agencies? Well, sure. But what about this one in the lower right? What's wrong with this picture? Why would the Bell and Zoller Coal Company of Chicago, Illinois, be ordering Philippine envelopes? Well, they didn't. They were ordering some of theirs, but somebody forgot to change the envelope dye. The Philippine envelopes were made in the same manufacturing facility as the U.S. envelopes, but the U.S. production was massive. They had a special factory doing nothing but the U.S. envelopes every day of the week, turning them out by the billions. The Philippine envelopes were much smaller in quantity. They'd send in an order every once in a while, and it basically only took them a day or two to produce it. So Bell and Zoller must have gotten a rather interesting surprise when they got their shipment.
Were they mostly used in the U.S.?
The Philippine envelopes? No, not as in that form. Bell and Zoller was I'm sure they got regular U.S. stamped envelopes, but not these. Okay. Now, this is one that I kind of put as an interesting thing because it is an albino envelope. Albino envelopes only exist on the issue from 1908 to 1935, the one we've just been looking at. They don't exist on the earlier ones that are overprinted, and they don't exist on the later ones because of the equipment that was used. In 1908, the new contractor had to come up with their equipment, and the old contractor, who had specially designed equipment for envelopes just for the government contract alone, wasn't going to turn loose of them. So they had to go get their own equipment. They had one type of equipment that did the printing, and then they had to take the printed paper and put it into a second piece of equipment that did the folding and the gumming. The earlier contractor had a all-in-one piece of equipment where you put in cut to shape pieces of paper on the front end, and it printed them, gummed them, folded them, and counted them in one operation. So in this case, if that feeder happened to pick up two pieces of paper at once, the top piece would get the printed ink. The bottom piece would not get the ink, but would get the impression of the envelope dye through. And of course, you might just find one of these in a box, and that's what happened. And they're scarce, and there's different ways people have looked at whether they should be cataloged or not. Most of the Philippine collectors that I know think they should be cataloged, and I agree. So this is something you could look for and occasionally find, and they're not huge rarities and not real big dollar items. Well, the next issue is kind of a special one. It was only issued on one occasion in 1927. It was printed locally, and a lot of the literature on this suggests that this was printed because of a shortage, that they didn't have enough envelopes and needed to go get it done locally. I don't think that's true. And the reason is that in looking at the orders, there was no order pending right at the time. if the Bureau of Posts needed more envelopes to be shipped from the manufacturer in the States, they knew how to do it, but they waited. I think it's something different. I think this came as part of what I see a broader interest. Since World War I, the Bureau of Posts no longer had Americans at the helm. It was an imaginative time. We see interesting things like the Legislative Palace issue. We see the interesting airmail overprints that were coming out at that time. They were doing some interesting things with machine cancels, putting slogans in them. And they also did something else that started around 1927 that's shown on this envelope in the lower right, the thrift slogans. And these are fascinating things. They seem to have been hand stamped at different post offices in different ways. And if anyone asks me to translate that one, my best guess is that it says, make money, save this envelope, and sell it to a collector.
You nailed it.
So on the upper left, you see one with the additional words, money order, and this saying in Spanish, aeropostal. What was that for? Well, we know what a money order is for, but why put a money order language on the front of an envelope? I haven't found anything in any of the archives, or I've gone back and looked through local newspapers of the time at the Bureau or at the Library of Congress. I've found nothing. Maybe there's something in Manila that is in the archives there that would tell us. My best guess is that they put that on the envelopes as a promotional thing, that the stamped envelopes were popular primarily in the provinces. Easy to sell an envelope to somebody at the post office when they needed to mail something instead of them having to go somewhere else to find an envelope. And I think this was a promotional thing, just like the thrift slogans, trying to promote the idea of using the money order system, and particularly for mail order business. The next series of envelopes came out in 1935. At the same time, it's the next big definitive series. We've got a die proof of the 1935 Rizal design. That same die was used to make the postal card, but we see a different design on the stamped envelopes. That was taken from the 20 centavos stamp. Why did they do this differently? Well, the correspondence that found indicates that the stamped envelope manufacturer said, we can't do a design with Rizal's full face. We have to have a profile. Do you have something else? They were in a hurry and they looked through the other stamps of the definitive series, and this one was the only one that had a profile view of a person. This one has kind of been referred to a number of times. I'm not sure if this was official or not. It was called the Juan de la Cruz issue. And apparently, every once in a while, I run into someone who asks me who the famous patriot Juan de la Cruz was. I hear some laughter here. I guess a lot of our members know. Does anyone want to volunteer who Juan de la Cruz was?
Like a Joe Smith. He's an everyday guy.
Yeah, it was just like John Q. Citizen or G.I. Joe. Yeah, but the actual artwork came from a bronze sculpture, which is a beautiful sculpture. I've seen pictures of it. Absolute wonderful piece of art. And I think they selected it because it was a great piece of art, but I think also because this kind of emphasizes how the power of government comes from the ordinary person and not from royalty or elite. And so that became the design on this envelope. Now, this series of envelopes was manufactured by a more updated type of equipment, and there aren't many varieties. You can find them with different the printed corner cards. You can find, but they were no privately printed corner cards for individual customers. They were just the post office ones and some different watermarks. What I think is more interesting is how these same envelopes got used later. They were demonetized after the Japanese occupation, but existing supplies were recycled with two different types of overprints. The earlier one just blacked out Commonwealth of the Philippines. The later one added some additional language about the puppet government. And you tend to see these mostly used in philatelic form, as in the lower one, and less often as regular mail. This one came from the provinces to Manila. But there's an envelope from the Japanese occupation period that's not in the catalog that I like a lot. This is not in Gene Garrett's catalog. It's not in any of the standard postal stationery catalogs. And a postal stationery purist might say, well, this is not a stamped envelope. Where is the indicium? Well, it doesn't have an indicium because it didn't need one. These envelopes were prepared at one time specifically for civilian internees to get their first mail to to someone outside of the Philippines. The envelopes were prepared that way. You can see they received a postmark. They did not require postage. And you can find them if you are lucky enough from this one at the right from Camp Holmes in Baguio. Most commonly, you see them from Santa Tomas because that's where most of the internees were. I believe you can also get them from Davao. And you see how they were having the typical censor marks, which you see from the time. And I kind of think these should be listed in the catalog. What does everybody else think? Well, we see these same 1935 envelopes get recycled for a third time because after being demonetized at the start of World War II, they're demonetized again when the Japanese gave way to the invasion forces. And when the troops arrived in the invasion at Leyte in 44, existing pre-war envelopes were hand-stamped overprinted with the word victory. Hand-stamped victories are real scarce, but the envelopes are actually some of the easiest to get. But you got to be careful. In the upper left is the image that I just took off of eBay a few days ago and offered by someone that regularly sells Philippine items. I mean, this is not a victory item. It's got a 1940 postmark on it. We're being flooded with these victory fakes. We see them coming out of, a lot of people are marketing them out, or there is a person in Canada. There's one in Romania, Paris. There's some coming out of Manila. I don't know the source of them, but they are being heavily faked. But these did get used, and the interesting thing is that the hand-stamped victories were only in use for a short time because they had pre-war stamps with the victory overprinted on them, in large quantities, but they didn't supply stamped envelopes. So you see the stamped envelopes continuing to be used for a while after. And in the bottom one here, we have one of the press printed victory stamps, but it was put on top of one of the Japanese occupation envelopes. You can see the arrow points to a little bit that you can see of what was the overprint sticking out from underneath. That's a Japanese occupation envelope repurposed. 19. This next one is a personal favorite.
Excuse me. Greg.
I bought this envelope at WESTPEX a long time ago, and it was basically being sold as a first day cover. And I thought it looked nice, and it was on the victory envelope, and that looked okay to me. And later on, after I became a little more knowledgeable about stamped envelopes, I learned that this large number 8 size envelope only had 64 of them overprinted with the hand stamped victory. So that is a real tough one. And I don't mind that it was actually used as a first aid cover.
The left side of the plate against Jordan Romano. That's where fastball right over for strike one.
Next slide takes us to the Republic period. It was 1948 when the Republic first ordered stamped envelopes on a post-war basis. They ordered them from the American Banknote Company. The banknote company prepared the die, but they sent the die back to the same U.S. envelope contractor to actually have the envelopes themselves printed. So these are actually on the same equipment as the U.S. envelopes were being made at the time, and they have that same size, which is equivalent to the U.S. Post Office number 5. These are interesting. I've shown the first 4 here. They had them reprinted at different times with different envelopes. And then later, the remainders were printed and revalued for 10 cents in 1970. And that is the last time that the Bureau of Post, now Phil Post, has issued any stamped envelopes. So we are at the end of the era of stamped envelopes. I said beginning to end. They started in 1898, ended in 1970. But of course, the successors are aerograms, which are a whole interesting collecting area of themselves. But they're non-envelopes, so they're not in today's presentation. So I hope everyone learned something that you didn't know before. I appreciate very much the chance to be the presenter today.
Thank you.